What you just heard was a transmission by a shortwave radio station known as the Lincolnshire Poacher, purportedly used to send messages to British spies abroad during and after the Cold War. Named after the first two bars of an English folk tune that introduced the coded message that followed, the Lincolnshire Poacher operated from the 1970s until 2008. When asked by a Daily Telegraph reporter about such transmissions, a British official remarked, somewhat obliquely, I might add, "These are what you suppose they are. People shouldn't be mystified by them. They are not for, shall we say, public consumption." Today on Coming In From the Cold, Unacknowledged Transmissions, exploring the world of number stations. Welcome to Coming In From the Cold, a monthly podcast from CNA, which explores long-forgotten or never-remembered events, policies, and strategies of the Cold War. Hello, I'm Bill Rosenow, Senior Policy Historian at CNA. To help us understand number stations, how they were employed during the Cold War, and what their status is today, I'm joined by two guests. First, Dave Broyles, the director of CNA's Special Activities and Intelligence Program. Dave is also a fellow CNA podcaster who's the co-host of AI with AI. Dave, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here.
Our other guest is Māris Goldmanis, who is coming to us today from his home in Latvia. Māris is a historian, writer, and co-founder and editor of numberstations.com. That's numbers-station.com. He's the author of an important War on the Rocks article explaining the mystery of number stations. I should add that mystery is in quotation marks. More on that a bit later. In the meantime, Māris, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Hello.
Great. It's great to have you here. You're in Latvia, obviously. It must be a very tense time for you and your friends in the region. Why don't we jump right in? Māris, can you tell us just what is a number station?
Well, first of all, a number station is a term that is only used by the media. The documents, the CIA documents, the KGB documents, they use term mostly radiogram or the one-sided message. It means it's a message, coded message either by Morse code, more classically. There is also some stations that are send fake messages for training or for misleading intelligence agencies, and there are some messages that are real.
In your article, Māris, you write, and I'm going to quote, "The one-time pad, the only mathematically unbreakable encryption system, is usually a sheet of paper with random numbers in groups of 5 or more digits. Typically, the letters of the message are converted into numbers and are added to numbers from the notepad using a simple mathematical operation known as false addition. The result is then transmitted. The recipient uses the same page from his own one-time pad and extracts the plain message text by applying false subtraction to the encrypted message." So this, I think, is a fascinating aspect, is that, as you say, it's the only mathematically unbreakable encryption system.
Yes, because you need access to the one-time pads physically. You cannot simply decode them sitting at a desk, and you must understand the mathematical equations. For that, you need the source code. Without source code, there is no decoding. And you must be very careful if you are a spy to keep these code books, because if you will be captured alive, then the agency will be able to gain these code books. It has happened before, by the KGB has captured some of these codes from the CIA in the 80s.
Well, and you don't want to do what I believe it was the NKGB did in the 1940s maybe 30s, where they reused one-time pads, which were in short supply, which allowed our cryptographers or cryptologists to decode what became known as Venona. Dave, I'm wondering if I could turn to you. Can you talk about the actual broadcasting in the sense of like why shortwave? Sounds extremely old-fashioned, but what are the advantages to it, and how does it kind of work?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting and perhaps not surprising if you're familiar with shortwave that this is the technique for communication. The shortwave band is in the radio band, kind of like when we turn on the radio and we hear our local music stations. It's in a frequency that's actually lower energy than that wavelengths of electromagnetic frequency. And it's in what's called the high frequency band. So about 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. And again, in comparison on your radio dial, that's like 88 megahertz to about 110, at least in the US. The property of those particular radio waves, they have a peculiar property in that if you sort of aim them up into the atmosphere, they will bounce off of the upper atmosphere, off of charged particles up there. And that allows them to propagate really far. So again, our normal radio stations are only go as far as about line of sight, which is about 40 miles or about 64 kilometers. But with the shortwave and the bouncing off the atmosphere, you actually get multiple bounces, and this stuff can travel halfway across the globe. And so it allows you to basically broadcast very long distances. And so this is actually the choice of communication for intra country, intra continental communication. And the nations have established a variety of these sort of radio stations. I think, right, we have the Voice of America that broadcasts U.S. related materials and news and things like that. All the nations have these sort of broadcast stations because you can propagate them over such a long distance, and all you need is a relatively simple transceiver to pick it up. So that's really the choice here, is that you can use this method to bounce your message very far across. It also makes it a little bit harder to figure out where it's coming from because of that bouncing. You have to have a little bit, shall we say, more infrastructure in place if you want to try to figure out where the source of the message is coming from.
Yeah, and the community of number stations enthusiasts around the world, they're the people who spent much time and energy trying to actually locate the source of these transmissions, which is not easy. Apparently, the Lincolnshire poacher, people track that down to an Royal Air Force base in Cyprus, although I'm not sure that's completely definitive, but it's not easy to find them.
Yeah, Bill, it's funny you mentioned Cyprus. I remember I was in Afghanistan in 2014 with the Marines and our coalition forces when we were drawing down our forces in back at that time. And I recall the UK troops talking about how when they would be leaving the theater and returning to the UK, they would make a stop in Cyprus for decompression, right, to have a little bit of relaxing time before then going back home. So there's clearly a link with Cyprus there and the Brits. So maybe not so mysterious.
Yeah, that's nice of the Brits. I mean, they take care of their people. Cyprus, wow. Luckily, they didn't send these poor guys down to Diego Garcia to decompress.
I think U.S. troop decompression was in Kuwait, so that's a little bit different kind of location.
Māris, to turn back to you and your article, I mentioned at the beginning that the title of your piece in War on the Rocks, explaining the mystery of number stations, you don't think they really are a mystery. And you write, too often number stations are described as spooky, creepy, or mysterious. And the discussion stops there. And I want to say, I've become, I don't know whether you call me a fan of number stations, but I've listened to the Conet collection. A real super fan created a 5 CD set of recordings of number stations transmissions. They are hypnotic. They are, I do find them strange and hard to get out of my mind once I've heard them. But I think you're making a more important point. Yeah, they sound strange, but they really aren't mysterious. Is that a fair way to characterize your view?
The problem is like that because they are games, they are movies that make some horror story out of them. But actually, for me, there is no mystery anymore because like 2 years ago, I found very big Latvian KGB case in the Latvian archives. where KGB was monitoring these stations for like 10 years. And they even made a recording of these stations. For me, as a historian, I'm more interested in factual use of these stations than mystery. I understand why they sound creepy, because it's like old, very bad quality, and it's not ominous. But they are not ghosts. They are very sophisticated use of technology. So for me, it's a bit funny that they are mysterious or creepy.
Yeah, the study that you mentioned, and we'll provide a link to this, KGB's monitoring effort of number stations during the Cold War in Latvia. And you went into the KGB archives in Latvia, and that was a source of your information for this, right?
To my mind, the KGB archives in Latvia, that one case, they were most definite because they point blank talk about foreign agencies doing radio broadcasts and how we must monitor them, we must group them, and we must study them. Well, fully proven.
The title of this episode of Coming In From the Cold is Unacknowledged Transmissions. I guess it's fair to say, although there have been archival material, as you said, and declassified FBI documents, no government has ever admitted to employing a number station. Is that true?
I would say yes, because first of all, the intelligence agency would not simply say that we are spying on some other country. You would get such a confirmation only from counterintelligence. The KGB counterintelligence would say he was caught with these stations. They also, the very, very famous case of Kuban 5, but that intelligence agency would say that we have used that for foreign operation. In some other country, no, we would not do that. We would not do that because that will be a big leak of information. Also, that's how it works. You know the famous thing about Mr. Cohen from Israel who was caught with, studied Morse codes and back in 60s. They would not acknowledge that he was sending these codes. It's the Syria that caught them, the transmitters and so on.
The key word here, I think, is plausible deniability, right? That's exactly what you want, the ability to give a communication. And then if someone asks you, did you send that? You just kind of shrug your shoulders. I can neither confirm nor deny it. It's the perfect setup.
Dave, I wanted to ask you a sort of an aesthetic question. So people, the number stations fans or super fans around the world, they're the ones who've come up with these names for at least some of the stations: Swedish Rhapsody, The Buzzer, Cherry Ripe, Gong, and of course the Lincolnshire Poacher. You've heard some of these. Do you find them fascinatingly eerie? Do you find them annoying? What is your reaction to them?
Yeah, I think there's a number of those variety, like quite undefinable words that kind of apply. I think I'm generally settling on the word unsettled. And I think the reason for that is I was thinking about other types of signals that you could bin under mysterious signals, although understanding that these aren't mysterious. And I was thinking, hey, we get strange signals from outer space, repeating radio frequencies. But with research, we've shown that, hey, there's a natural phenomenon. There's a pulsar out there, a star that's emitting these signals at regular intervals. And so it looks like maybe intelligent life, but it actually has a very rational, it's a natural phenomenon. We can describe it scientifically and understand it. Yeah, barring that description, we could maybe think that there's an alien species out there trying to communicate. So that's potentially an option, but really we actually do have a scientific explanation and it makes sense. In this case, for these types of signals with the number stations, we know what it is. It is a overt, secure communication between a nation state and its covert operatives. And that in itself makes it unsettling. We don't know whether that communication is keep calm and carry on, or whether it's an assassination order, right? And so we're left with this sort of dichotomy of, wow, there's a formal communication going on overtly, but in secret, and I don't know what it is. And that gives that air of uncanniness, unsettledness, and it's a purely human phenomenon.
That's very well put. Why don't we take a short break? When we come back, talk about contemporary uses of number stations.
Hi, listeners. I'm Nalanthi Samaranayaka, the director of CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis Program. We study issues ranging from maritime strategy to managing alliances and nuclear policy. We've expanded our work in the past few years to include Arctic strategy and policy analysis and the study of non-traditional security issues, such as women, peace and security, climate change and strategic partnerships, and ocean security. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please check out our webpage, cna.org/strategy.
Okay, we're back. One more thing I wanted to ask. There's a category of transmissions that I guess are adjacent to number stations called noise stations. The buzzer, which is a Russian one, is an example of a noise station. And as I understand it, the Russians and the Soviets before them have used these basically to communicate internally with their own military forces. Do I have that right?
I'm sorry, but you are wrong. Buzzer is not a noise station. You must understand what buzzer is. Buzzer is simply a noise maker. It is a frequency maker to occupy the frequency constantly. You understand that if you search for it, you might find there's voice messages. The buzzer signal stops and the voice message comes. The point of this marker is to keep the frequency closed for all time for the military, and when this marker does stop, there can be a voice message that is read by a military radio man who is like a Anna, Roman, and so on. Before starts with a call sign, like a was long used call sign was Mikhail, Dmitry, Zhenya, Boris. Then there is numbers, few numbers, there is a code word called monolith. The big thing about buzzer is not a buzzer signal doesn't matter, it's just simply a noise maker. The big thing about buzzer is those voice messages. They come rarely, some 3 times a week maybe. These messages are not announced. You simply must listen to this signal like 24 hours a day, and then you might hear some voice message on it. When this signal drops, you cannot decode the buzzer signal. If you want a noise station, a real noise station, they are real noise stations that are being decoded. Velixo 6, they call it. They are coded messages within noise. They are sent from Russian foreign service to embassies. They can be decoded. You will get the numbers from them. With those numbers, will be decoded by the officials at covert embassies.
So if I'm understanding correctly, if I can summarize that, there seems to be like 2 functions for a noise station. One is to basically reserve a frequency for communication purposes by in essence blocking it with just random noise, and you remove that noise when you're ready to actually send your message, which to me sounds perfect as a military thing, because I can put some poor private listening to the frequency 24/7 and just have them write down the message when it finally comes through. But the other method, it sounded like, was to actually send messages in the noise itself. So you send out what sounds like a bunch of static, but in it you've encoded your message, and only by knowing what to look for in the noise can you decode the message that's hidden there, even though it's again in plain sight.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Dave. Now I think I understand a little bit better. So at the end of the Cold War, there seemed to be an apparent decline in the use of number stations. You don't have an East German Stasi anymore, no Czech STB, no Romanian Securitate. My Romanian isn't up to speed, I'm afraid. Less need for communications with agents, or fewer agents out there in the field. But number stations haven't disappeared, have they? Māris, what countries are particularly active today?
Well, in America, if you tune with your radio, you will mostly hear from Cuba. They use mixed mode of white noise and numbers. So also, of course, it's very much attributed to Russia and also Poland. However, Poland has dropped some of these stations in the last 10 years. You only use very few of them right now. There is also from Ukraine, also in China. Of course, North Korea was doing this very interesting way within the state radio. And of course, there is also South Korea doing these messages. But then South Korea is very funny because they use actual pop music as interval signal. You can hear very often some K-pop without actual message.
Yeah, that's interesting that the South Koreans use K-pop, which of course is their their greatest export. Pretty shrewd. Yeah, you mentioned in your article that Radio Pyongyang continues to broadcast coded messages disguised as mathematics or physics problems for, quote, distant university students. Not the most subtle. Do you see, like, looking at what Russia is doing now in Ukraine or just other countries more generally, is there on the military side or espionage side, do you see number stations going away, or will they always have at least a niche appeal for governments?
I think we'll always see a role for this form of communication. And I think there's a couple things to think about. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that we've seen fewer of them over the last couple decades, because when you take a step back and look at what's happened to the globe over the last couple decades, we have the internet now, and the world's a lot more transparent than it used to be. So maybe you need fewer foreign agents out there in the world because you can actually find a lot of that information just over the internet and a lot faster than some sort of archaic forms of communication. But I think why this role will always still be there for number stations is because it's not traceable. And that's going to be a really key element as we go forward and the world continues to become more transparent. If you think about a place like London, which probably, I believe, has every street corner under surveillance of a camera, right? It's a lot harder to move around in that environment and do things physically without being recorded somewhere or somehow or seen, etc. So there's a huge advantage in clandestine communications to not having to go to a physical spot, pick up a physical object, or do anything that requires something that announces your presence. Even going onto the internet, right? I have to be very careful about what websites I go to. That's all traceable and it's all detectable, right? I can cover my tracks and there's lots of ways to hide on the internet, sure. But at the end of the day, a radio signal, you never know whether it got received. I could have a transceiver in my home. I may not. It may look like a normal shortwave. In fact, it probably is a normal shortwave radio, right? It's not some sort of special, weird, goofy piece of equipment. So it allows me as a hidden agent or whatever to receive a signal without revealing in any other way to anybody else that I have received that signal. And you can't find that through many other methods. And so that's why I think you'll continue to see this.
Any additional thoughts from Māris or Dave?
Well, what I recommend for people who are interested in these stations are to not just come to the number stations.com. We also have a Discord server. You can go in this Discord server and register there very freely and discuss these things with other members. You can join this community if you're interested. That is the main message. If people want to learn more, there are course sites to learn. The site that I have maintained. There is also numbers and oddities. There is also a very old site called Enigma 2000, also the Priam.org. If you are interested, not just listening to some creepy signals, you can always go to these sites and search them. There are a lot of information in there.
Wonderful. I want to thank our guests for just a fascinating discussion on a unexplained, but actually now somewhat explained communications phenomenon. Māris Goldmanis, Dave Broyles, thank you very much for joining us. Great discussion. As always, thanks very much to our producer, John Stimson. And finally, most important, thanks very much to our listeners. Please join us for another episode of Coming In From the Cold. In the meantime, stay warm out there. Coming In From the Cold is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimson. Our theme music is by Edward Gringa. If you enjoy our show, we'd love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next month.